What happens if you outgrow the brand of your podcast, you outgrow the topic of your podcast, and you want to change it? What do you do? I mean, it's something that comes up quite often, I believe. You set the brand for your podcast, you set your topic, you talk about it for a while. This is what you want to talk about when you start your podcast. But actually, over time, you start to evolve away from that. There can be a bunch of reasons why you might feel you end up boxed into a corner. It could be something like listener feedback. So actually listeners start to talk about the fact that, you started out talking about mountain biking. I always talk about this example. You started talking about mountain biking, but actually, or you started talking about mountain biking equipment. All you were talking about was pedals and gears and frames and all that kind of stuff. But you got some listener feedback which said, we want you to talk about skills as well. I want to know how you use this kit, or I want to talk about trails. We want to hear where you go on your bike every week. So can you tell us about that kind of stuff? So sometimes listener feedback can show you that, that initial topic that you chose is actually a bit narrow and you should be broadening out. Otherwise, it might be trends in the industry. So maybe I started talking about mountain biking, but actually the trend these days is that nobody wants to pedal anymore. So it's all about electric mountain bikes. So actually that's what it should be now. So I think I want to change my brand from just, mechanical mountain biking kit to electric mountain bikes. So it could be a trend, just something changing in your industry. Maybe it's just your own interests. Maybe actually I started talking about mountain biking kit, but I just don't really care about that anymore. I'm not that bothered about fixing, about building bikes. I just want to send it to the shop, and actually I want to talk about trails. I want to talk about the places I'm exploring, the adventures I'm having. So it's just interest based. And I mean, maybe you just get to know how it works a bit better, to be honest. Maybe you chose that brand in the early days. Maybe you chose a name in the early days because you thought it was clever, you thought it was funny. And nowadays you're realizing that people can't find you because the brand, the name of your podcast doesn't actually mean anything. It doesn't tell people what the show's about, what the topic is. And you just want to change it. You're realizing that, for SEO purposes, for search purposes, for discovery, all that kind of stuff, you need a better name, you need a better brand. So it's time to change it. So basically, when it comes down to it, changing a brand is always painful. We've done it a few times at the podcast host with various things. We rebranded, the logo, the colours, all that kind of stuff. That was pretty horrible to go through. It's just, it's exciting in a way, but there's so much work goes into it. Our membership, so the academy, the podcast host academy that I mentioned, we initially gave that a wider brand. We called it Fan Fishing because it was all about growing fans, and we thought we'd talk about video as well because we record video, we do YouTube, we do other types of content marketing. So it was about growing fans rather than just podcasting. But we discovered that from user feedback that it was too wide, it was too vague, people didn't really understand it. So we had to change it, and we rebranded that to the Podcast Host Academy. So now people know what it's about, it's more clear. And so there's another example as well. That was very painful. Changing URLs, moving the website, changing the logos, all that kind of stuff. So this stuff is painful. And it's also painful if a lot of people know it. So it depends a bit on your stage. That obviously, nobody really knew Fan Fishing. All the work was on our end. It was all painful in terms of actually just all the logistics, all of the work that went into the colours, the logo, the website, all that kind of stuff. But actually, there's external pain as well in that if people know you, if people know your brand, if your brand has equity, you've been around for 2 or 3 or 4 years, even longer. If you change a logo, people are like, oh, I don't recognize that. If you change the name especially, it can be completely different. And big companies do this all the time. It happens with big companies. Big companies try not to do it as much as possible, obviously, but it does happen all the time that they have to do it because they have to change with the times for various reasons. But it's difficult. There's a lot of work has to go into changing, like say, Pepsi, Coke. I wanted to change to something a bit different. They wanted to just be the Coke company or something like that. Creating this new brand and making people realize that it's the same thing, like bringing that brand loyalty. People who love Pepsi, you want them to go over and drink this Coke company Coke as well. You have to make that association. There's advertising, there's talk, there's all sorts of things that has to go into basically changing it over and making sure that people realize that this new company is the same as the old company. So that brand equity, that that trust, that everything that you've built up, the value you've built up around that brand transfers to the new one. So that's why it's very difficult in the later days. So that's why I would say, if you're thinking about it, if you feel like you want to, do it sooner rather than later, because the later you leave it, the harder it is, and the more you lose by changing a brand. The thing is, though, podcasts have a lot of power in being able to handle a brand change. The way that they work, it makes it easier for you to be able to change a brand. So let's get into that. I want to talk about how you can do it on a podcast. The power that podcasting has in doing branding is the fact that it's a push medium. So people have subscribed to your show. So you imagine you're changing a brand. The subscription goes out to them automatically. You know, they subscribed to the Mountain Bike Spark podcast, the Podcraft podcast. And if I change the name of Podcraft tomorrow to the podcast education show, then they would still get it. It's just that it would change the name in their subscription software. They don't have to go away and find it. The podcast comes to them. So that's the danger. When you change your brand, you know, it makes it harder for people to find you. You know, they search for Podcraft and suddenly you've changed your brand to the podcast education show. They're not going to find it. They're not even going to know it was the same show. But with podcasting, they've already subscribed. The people that know you, the people that trust you, the people that follow you, they've already subscribed. So the show's coming to them. So if one day they get a show called Podcraft and then the next day that feed changes to the podcast education show, they still get that episode. And if you explain on that first episode, so we've changed our name to the podcast education show, this is why we've done it, all blah, 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 then they go, oh, cool, and they keep listening. And there's not really a massive drop-off there. So in a lot of ways, podcasting, because it's a push medium, you're pushing content to them, you're not relying on them coming to you, it can take it a lot more easily. All you do is change the artwork, the title, tell the difference, tell the listeners, explain the change, and it's all good. So that accounts for existing listeners. New ones, obviously, they won't notice because new listeners haven't found you yet. So it's not a big issue for them. So there are a few difficult parts in it, of course. I mean, if you change the brand really heavily, you might have to change the domain name. You might have to change your website. So there can be some issues around that. It's the same as any time if you want to change a website. It's something you can do. You can pack up a website. You can back it up. You can replace it in another place. You can actually, with your hosting company, if you change a domain name, you buy a new domain name, you can actually associate hosting with two separate domain names. So it's actually possible to do it quite easily sometimes. It depends what hosting you're with, but changing a domain name can be actually relatively easy, although you might need to take a little bit of technical help if that's not something that you're very good with. The other way is you might want to just evolve it rather than completely change it. So this came up because one of our members in the Podcast Host Academy, if you want to see details on that, go to the Podcast Host Academy, thepodcasthost.com/academy, see what we do over there. But one of our members runs a show called the CGI Podcast. And it was based around CGI design, so CGI effects, like creating animations, designing stuff like that. And what he's thinking about doing is, instead of changing it entirely, change it to as if it's an acronym. So he's going to evolve it, possibly, it's one of the options, possibly from the CGI podcast to the Create, Generate, Inspire podcast. So it'll still actually be called the CGI podcast, technically. CGI podcast, Create, Generate, Inspire podcast. So it's possible that you can actually just evolve a brand so that they're still associated. You might be able to keep the same domain, you might be able to keep a lot of the same stuff, like that could keep the same logo, for example, could still be CGI Podcasters with a tagline in the bottom. Makes it more recognizable. You lose less of the brand equity that you've already built up. So it could be an evolution as opposed to a complete change. If you change the name entirely, though, what I would do is create a page based on that. So create a page based on that name that explains it. So, if people type in Podcraft Podcast and I've changed it to something else, they'll still find the page that we've put up called the Podcraft Podcast, and that page will explain what the change has been. It'll explain what the Podcraft Podcast was about. This is why we changed the name, and here's where you go for the new show. So you can put little kind of breadcrumbs there so that the old brand is still searchable. You can still explain what's happened to it and direct them towards the new brand. So create a new page based on it. That's what I would recommend. Like I said, though, it's always painful, no matter how you change your brand. So do it sooner rather than later. If you feel like you're wanting to, because the worst thing is if you feel you're boxed in a corner, you actually just stop doing the show, and if you stop doing the show, there's no value in the brand at all. So actually, it's worth doing it anyway.